Welcome back. This is the Something Venture podcast. I am Kent Lindstrom. I am your host. My guest today is Monique Woodard. How are you doing?
I'm good. How's it going?
Thank you so much for doing this.
Yes.
So Monique is a venture capitalist. She has previously worked at 500 startups. She has invested in companies such as Blavity, Court Buddy, Silver Nested, Mented Cosmetics, and has founded the organization Black Founders. And on top of that is the inventor of the Speak Chic app. Is that right?
Yes.
Which is an app that teaches you how to say fashion brands.
That was my second startup.
You know, it's funny. I went to college with the nephew of Ralph Lauren, Brad Lauren. So I happen to know that you say Lauren not Loren.
Yes.
Sophia Loren is a French actress. It is
a lot of people don't know how to say things.
Pronounced Lauren. So what is your? Let's start with your path into. So obviously that tells us you've been an entrepreneur at some point in your career. What's your path from you didn't start in the normal place that a venture capitalist starts is they grow up in Northern California. They go to Stanford and their roommate gets a job in venture capital and hires them.
Right.
And I'm not kidding. I've heard people tell that story
Exactly.
In fact, it's one of the things.
And then they get gifted a Patagonia vest.
Pretty much.
and they wear it forever.
I tell people this and they have no idea what I'm talking about. But when you get on a Harry Steppings podcast and they say, how did you end up in venture capital? And they say, I fell into it.
Right.
Even if you did fall into it, make something up.
Yeah.
Because you didn't fall into it from the housing projects in Chicago. You fell into it from Stanford. So
from a very privileged point.
So I assume that was not your path.
That was definitely not my path. I did not grow up in Northern California. I grew up in a really small rural town called Ocala, Florida. And, grew up on a dirt road. My grandfather was a farmer. My dad worked fire rescue for NASA. My mom worked for AT&T. So very working class background. My dad, he got hurt at NASA, and so he had to retire from that. And then he owned a fish market and also farmed like his father. And, we constantly had pigs and chickens and things like that.
This is kind of I would suggest, though, that's kind of entrepreneurial.
For sure.
Losing your job and starting, getting hurt and then starting something. It seems like...
Yeah, I definitely come from an entrepreneurial family of small business entrepreneurs, right? So my grandfather owned land, and we still own that land in Florida at a time when, in the 30s and 40s when Black people didn't own land in mass.
Yeah.
And so, I certainly saw him raise cows and sell cows at auction and, hire people to farm the land that we owned. And so that was a business.
Yeah.
My dad at one point owned a fish market. I would, come home from high school and run the register in the afternoon. And he also grew peas and sold them to people, and hired people to pick the produce, and so it's certainly a very entrepreneurial family.
I mean, these are often the kids who do the best in do very well in business, where they were working the cash register when they were 12 or whatever it is, and not going to summer camp. Well, maybe going to summer camp, but not doing there's people who do all these things, they get experiences, and there's people who are no, I need you to work the cash register.
Yeah.
And it's hot, and you still need to work the cash register.
Yeah, there's a 10-year-old girl at my local farmers market who handles the money for her parents.
Yeah.
And I'm I want to invest in her so bad. I know she's going to be something.
It's really true.
Yeah.
I had growing up, I had the perfect I had two grandfathers, and one of them ran a cigar store in Muscatine, Iowa, and was the happiest guy in the world. He ran it. He was the guy of the town. He was on the board of the bank. And the other one worked for the phone company, and he was just miserable, but he had job security.
Yeah.
And I kind of took away maybe just working for the big company is not the be all end all. So how did you make your way out of basically rural Florida? That is about as far from Silicon Valley as you can get in this country.
Yeah. So I think I had an Atari when I was super young, and I was the only kid on my block. The block was
the dirt
this
road.
dirt road where all of my family lived next to each other. So I was, the kid with an Atari, And I think of video games as like a gateway drug into computers. And so I also got a computer really early.
What was the computer? Was it the Atari?
It was the Commodore.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it was Commodore. And so my dad knew that I was really interested in computers, and I asked for one for Christmas, and my mom was like, no. And he bought it anyway.
Wow.
And I was taking classes in programming at like the computer classes were in town. So they had to drive me into town to take these computer classes.
Wow.
And I got super into it. But just like a lot of girls do, I didn't have anywhere for that to go. I went to like public elementary school and public middle school, and there was a computer class, but at some point those ended. And I didn't have any outlet for that. And then I sort of picked it up again in high school and taught myself HTML and taught myself just how to build things, and continued doing that sort of through university.
Right.
So I went away to school in Virginia to Hampton University, which is where a lot of my family has gone to university. And then my dad got sick. Yeah. And so I had to move back to Florida. Yeah. And so I transferred to University of Miami so I could be closer to Ocala, where they were. And I continued just sort of tinkering on the internet. And this is like late 90s.
Right.
And so
when the internet was cool.
Right. When new and not everyone knew how to do things. And it was much more difficult to do things, right?
But it was much more astounding when you did.
Yeah.
Like I remember, I don't know what your experiences were, but just the first time I logged into a computer that wasn't in, like, I was in San Diego and the computer was in Michigan.
Yeah.
And for some reason I was just like, that can't be. Like, it's amazing.
And then, because, again, I came from an entrepreneurial family, I was like, I should figure out how to make these things make money. Right. And so I was doing, like, internet marketing and arbitraging and sending and like monetizing traffic in all these different ways. And so that became a business. Mm-hmm. And that was my first business. So this is like early aughts, so early 2000s. Yeah. And I just got really good at that and got really good at building product. And so then people started asking me to build product for them.
How did they find you? I mean, you're in Miami at this point, right?
Right, I'm in Miami at this point. They found me on the internet.
Oh, right, of course. Miami's very cool. Like, was the shift from rural to urban part of getting you toward Silicon Valley? I mean, but at the time, I didn't even know. I just certainly knew that Silicon Valley existed. I just didn't know that that's where I should be. Right.
Right. I knew that I liked cities and I didn't want to be in a rural environment. So Miami was great. I was also deeply involved in the music industry at that time. So that was sort of the place for me to be. But I didn't get a sense that I should move across the country to Silicon Valley, because that's where you go if you want to do like technology things.
And what was music in Miami at that time? Like, what was that scene?
It was like Uncle Luke and nightclubs and spending a lot of time in like super amazing nightclubs with a lot of DJs.
Wow. That must have been kind of fun.
It was a lot of fun, but at some point you're like, I am getting a little too old for this. Yeah,
that's true.
My body cannot take it.
And I guess for the people who were still making money selling records at that time, or I guess it was CDs at the time, I guess the clouds were kind of gathering for sure, for like how that was going to go.
For sure.
Although live music seems to have come all the way back.
And I was booking shows for live music. I was booking shows for one of the oldest club in the U.S. Called Tobacco Road at the time. It's now gone out of Miami, but it was there then. And it was like blues acts like Coco Taylor and folks like that. And then I was also advancing Luther Campbell's tour dates. So kind of spending a lot of time arguing with promoters on the phone over, like, you better have Luke's money when he gets there.
You're like Two Live Crew.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow, this is so... One of my regrets there are things that I miss. I lived in Chicago. I went to school in Chicago and lived in Chicago. There was just great blues. Like Coco Taylor would come and play all the time.
She's great.
Just all kinds of Buddy Guy would play for, it was so cool.
Yeah.
And I'm here in San Francisco, and I'm sure there's some around somewhere, but we used to just go and see it. It was like
Yeah.
just unbelievable in these like hot little clubs in Chicago. But
Yeah.
so how does then Miami end up? Somehow you have to get yourself across the country.
Right. So I'm sort of like consulting and building product for other people and for small startups in Miami, such as they were.
Sure.
And a company in San Francisco knew of me, from the internet,
Yeah.
and got in touch and wanted to talk to me about something they were building. And I had never been to San Francisco, and I was like, sure, I'll come talk to you, whatever. And it was like that nonchalant.
Right.
And I flew to San Francisco. I talked to them about this video platform they were building. They made a job offer on my way back to Miami, and I moved 30 days later.
Wow. And then you were here.
And then I was here.
And then from
and
there,
I did it. I still didn't even really get that, oh, this is the place. It wasn't a place that I was driving toward.
Yeah.
I just fell into it.
I was trying to avoid that. Yeah.
I fell into it.
It's, Mark Andreessen calls it, they're way smarter than me over at Andreessen Horowitz, but scenius, which I guess is some concept that Brian Eno talked about, but that great art and technology comes when there's like a scene, like everyone's hanging out at the Algonquin Round Table in New York, and they're trading ideas. And it's called scenius. I don't know why it's called that, but that then you're kind of in the scene.
Yeah,
of
exactly.
Like things happening.
And I guess I said yes because I didn't have any reason to say no.
Yeah.
And so that's really how I try to approach a lot of things. Say yes until you like have a big reason why the answer is no.
Right. And how did you like it? Like, how did you work? Like, how did you like working for a company from being a...
I didn't love working for a company.
Yeah.
I still don't love working for companies.
Right.
But and so I was continuing to do a lot of like really entrepreneurial stuff on the side, and I was getting immersed in the scene and where things were happening. And I was going to like demo days, and I was going to meetups, and I was going to like all of the things that were popular here, in 2008 when I got here.
Right. And then how did you, I find this a lot too with people who are entrepreneurs. You started some other things, right? You started Black Founders. You did something with the mayor's office in San Francisco.
Yeah. So, I mean, starting Black Founders was really like me and my co-founders trying to scratch our own itch. So by the time I started Black Founders, I had started another company because I wanted to do something in the mobile space, and I wanted to do something on the App Store because that was what was big right at the moment. And that's how I started Speak Chic. But in the process of that, I was like going to meet investors and going to like these demo days and going to all these things. And my friends and I sort of gravitated to each other because we were all in tech. And so it's Hadia Mujahid, who now runs HBCU.VC, Nena Okuku, who is now a corporate lawyer in tech, and Chris Bennett, who runs Wonder School.
Oh, wow.
And we got together over dinner one night, and we were like, look, we're going to all these things, but we are the only Black people in the room.
Yeah.
And we were sort of like, what's that about? And so we, at this restaurant, I registered the domain name Black Founders. And we said, okay, we're going to have a meetup. We're going to have a happy hour for all the Black entrepreneurs that we know.
Right.
Because they have to be out here.
Right.
And so, like, a month, we, put out a notice that we were having a meetup and come have drinks and, like, let's get to know each other. And people came.
Wow.
And we were super surprised by how many people showed up. And so that set us off on a trajectory. So we just started getting people together for happy hours. And then people started to say, I need to know how to build a pitch deck because I'm pitching an investor next week. And I need to know what should be in this term sheet because, I'm getting a term sheet from an investor. And they started to ask us for all these things.
Yeah.
And so we would just like grab people like, okay, you've talked to investors, so why don't you lead a class on how to build a pitch deck? And you know what goes into a term sheet, so why don't you lead a class on how to negotiate a term sheet? And so we started doing all these things that were not just happy hours, but were additive. Right. And then, so Black Founders became much bigger than that. And then we did the Ideas Are Worthless conference about getting people from idea to execution.
By the way, that is a great idea. that is like for the young entrepreneurs listening, like, I've got an idea, but I don't want to tell you because you might steal it.
Exactly.
You really think people are walking around looking for stuff to do? Like,
there was a ton of that. And getting people from, thinking about a thing to actually building a thing.
Yeah.
And then people started to say, well, when are you coming to Atlanta? And when are you coming to New York?
Wow.
And we were sort of like, all of a sudden we had a thing on our hands, right? And so then we did it in New York and we did it in Atlanta. But mind you, at the same time, we were all starting our own businesses. Like Chris had a startup that predated Wonder School. I was doing Speak Chic. Hadia was working at Hewlett Packard. Nena was doing legal for startups. Like it was kind of crazy that we sort of had something.
And as people came together, like not to linger on this, but I'm just curious, like what was their sense of why there were so few Black or people of color in Silicon Valley?
Yeah.
Like what was the thinking on that? Like, and specifically, this is an issue in all business, but I had a Black CEO founder here who went to Stanford Business School. And I asked him, like, okay, and he's like, of my Stanford Business School, they all are very successful, but they didn't become entrepreneurs. They are working at Goldman Sachs and McKinsey and things like that. Like, what in Silicon Valley was the experience or the...
So I think there is certainly the ability to have the financial stability to be able to take on risk, right? And so if, let's say you're the first person in your family to go to college, you got into Stanford, the expectation, first of all, you're not going to drop out of Stanford to start anything.
That's right.
Right.
That actually, Mark Zuckerberg just couldn't even imagine that he couldn't just go back to Harvard or get a job. It probably wasn't in his imagination.
Right. I was on a panel, a few weeks ago in Canada, and the investor next to me said, well, if you start a company and it fails, don't worry about it because you've collected all of these skills, you've met all these people. So just think of it as the price of doing business, and you can just go back into the workforce. And I had to stop. I'd be like, no, let's talk about how that is a very privileged point of view. Like you can start a company, you can pour all of your savings into it, and you might end up failing, and then you will end up broke, and you may not have a job.
Yeah, right.
And it may take you longer to get a job if you are a woman, if you are a person of color, if you are LGBTQ, or a combination of any of those things.
Right.
And so I think investors have to be really thoughtful about the things that they just kind of casually say.
Yeah.
Right. And the things that they assume about a person's level of commitment to a thing just because they haven't maybe quit a job or just because they haven't poured every cent of their savings into their startup.
Yeah. And that's not what people like Mark Zuckerberg did. They kind of took some time off and everybody supported them and cheered them on. I mean, it's a really warm, welcoming environment for certain. Like, I'm kind of one of those people. Like, it's a pretty good deal. But yeah, that was funny. I was expecting him to, I'm sure it is about racism and all that, but he was like, no, it's just that when you've been through some stuff and Goldman Sachs offers you $600,000 a year, you take $600,000 a year.
Exactly.
And
there is also, we're backing up to like 2011, 12, right? And so there wasn't a huge discussion about diversity, and there wasn't, there weren't any funds run by Black VCs.
Is that true?
I mean,
I believe you. Yeah. I'm trying to disprove you. I'm not coming up with anything. That's kind of an astounding thing.
And the bias in the venture capital industry was even higher than it is now.
Right.
Because at least now people know that they need to hide the bias.
Right. Which could be even worse. Who knows?
Back then, it was just like, that's we are just looking for a white guy in a hoodie.
Yeah, who's 23.
Yeah, it can live on ramen.
Although then Zoom just went public at like some crazy amount of money. Now everybody's like, okay, I need a 40-year-old Asian person now. That's the new thing. One thing that I kind of struggle to figure out how to deal with is you said LGBTQ, women, African American, like those are all completely different things. Mm-hmm. Like, how do those things converge or diverge? So for example, if you're a gay man in Silicon Valley, I don't know how, I shouldn't say this, but I don't know how disadvantaged you might be versus a woman who's low income or whatever.
Right.
How do you
I mean, I
Of
think
course, all those things.
I think it all matters, right? Because you bring your identity with you into the room. But if you are a gay white man in San Francisco, and that may be somewhat hidden, right?
Right.
That's very different than being a black woman and walking into a room.
Right.
Like,
For sure.
I see it.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. Exactly.
I see it.
I mean, do the issues like, does each issue does each group need to just address itself and do its thing, or is there a unification of those issues into one thing of like, don't be biased against anybody for gender, age, race?
Yeah, I think we've seen a lot of so-called diversity and inclusion efforts where, they've said, okay, well, let's take care of the women thing first.
Uh-huh.
And then that by far overwhelmingly rolls in favor of white women.
Yes.
And women of color, Latinas, and black women in particular sort of get left out. And so I think it's hard to just say, well, we're just going to take care of this one thing, and then we'll get everything else.
Right,
we'll get to it.
Right.
I promise.
Well, yeah, you get the exceptional, like women are biased against women in tech, except for Sheryl Sandberg, who runs, you have these massive exceptions, like, whatever. But I guess that doesn't really solve the problem for a lot of people.
Yeah, and just because you have one woman on your staff who has done well, or one black person on your staff who has seemed to do well, doesn't mean that you've solved anything.
Right.
Like hiring one woman one woman partner at a VC firm doesn't mean that you've solved all of your issues.
Yeah. It is really notable at the VC firms. Like, I've got to say, I go to some of these conferences, and the worst is a crypto event. That's all white dudes.
Yeah.
But it is striking that there hasn't ended up being, and I guess it's just such a networked business. Like, you don't hire many people, first of all, in venture capital.
Yeah.
So then you would tend to hire one of your friends, and that friend would tend to be a white guy you went to Stanford with.
Right.
Seems to be the math that's been driving that forever.
Yeah.
How did you get from here to investing then? I mean, your entrepreneurial is great. Like, that's cool, but.
So, as I was running Black Founders and we were doing all of this programming, we were helping people, and I had always been the one who was most directionally positioned toward the venture capital community.
Right.
So I was the person who talked to VCs the most and, helped people fundraise and help them through early stage strategy. And one of the things that frustrated me the most was that, look, we could do all of this programming. We can do all of these, like helping people build a pitch deck. We can do all of this do all the introductions. But unless we were able to truly touch capital, it was all for nothing.
Yeah,
right. So it felt like we couldn't quite get to where we wanted to go.
Right.
And I was, I did that for like 4 years where I was, helping people fundraise and introducing them to people. And then I said, well, why don't I just do the thing that I'm doing for real?
Yeah, and get paid for it.
Instead of for free.
Pretty smart.
Instead of doing it for the free. So then I was super intentional about sort of reaching out to my network and figuring out, I mean, at that point, it's like, okay, well, now how do I get into venture capital?
Right, because there's one open job every 3 years in that business, so.
Exactly. And so it's funny. It's like you just keep trying a door, and the door doesn't work, and then you try the other door, and then you try the window. And then and so I'll tell you like a quick funny story. One night I was going to do a speaking engagement. I was looking for an old deck that I used for another engagement. And so I'm typing things into my computer, and I type in the word scale, and up pops this thing that says cover letter scale. And I was like, what is that? And I opened it, and it was a cover letter that I wrote to Scale Venture Partners. It's a terrible cover letter also. Very poorly written. I was like, who wrote this? And it was about a job at Scale on their portfolio team.
Wow.
Fast forward like years later, Kate Mitchell and I are good friends. She's a huge supporter, and one of the investors in something that I'm doing that's new.
Wow, that's incredible.
So it came like all the way full circle. And of course, the next time I saw her, I had to show it to her.
That's right. That is the problem with the internet. Like some of your work, some of my earlier podcasts, like I kind of wish they weren't out there, but it's just put it out there, and that's what that is.
But I truly moved on to the investor side of the table at 500 Startups, and I had known folks from there for quite some time, and I think after my fellowship ended with the city of San Francisco, someone reached out, I think it might have been Sean, and said, what are you up to these days? Do you have any startups that we should be looking at? And, what's going on with you? Right. And so I kind of came in and told them what was up with me. And what was up with me was that, like, I'm thinking about investing, and I'm thinking about investing in this way, and here's how I see things. And they were sort of like, oh, well, let's continue to talk about that. And so then I'd already known that I had a deeper discussion with Dave and Christine. And
the folks who run 500
The folks who ran 500. Now Christine Tsai is the CEO of 500. And started to get to know the team. And then eventually they said, well, why don't you come invest here at 500?
And 500 Startups is a pretty it's a venture capital firm for sure, but it's had kind of a unique idea about how to do it, which was that every entrepreneur doesn't come out of Silicon Valley necessarily.
Right. It's a global fund. And so, they definitely believe that there's opportunity outside of Silicon Valley. And we've certainly seen that, like the Southeast Asia Fund is doing really well. Yep. Their investments in Japan. I did a lot of deal flow opening up for sub-Saharan Africa when I was there.
Yeah, I remember they had a program called, it was Geeks on a Plane. Was that their program?
Yes, Geeks on a Plane.
It was kind of cool. You really kind of had to have some time to do it, but for a couple weeks, you'd fly around Southeast Asia with a group of people.
Exactly.
And you'd all kind of get off and meet people and get drinks at night and go visit startups during the day. And
exactly. And I led the charge for Geeks on a Plane Africa. So we went to Nigeria, Ghana, and South Africa over the span of about 2 weeks.
And what was that? So, what was that? As I've been around the world in different entrepreneur communities, they're all very different. Mm-hmm. Like when I was in Dublin, people would raise money, and then that was kind of the end game. Like they'd raise money, and then they could work with their friends for the next 4 years. Whereas in Silicon Valley, you raise money, you're like, how fast could we spend this and then raise another round? What's Africa characterized? I mean, obviously it's very diverse, but what's it characterized by? Right.
Well, it's different everywhere. So it's different in Lagos, Nigeria. It's
Africa,
different even from Lagos, Nigeria to Abuja, Nigeria, right?
Wow. Okay,
and it's obviously going to be much different from Lagos, Nigeria to Cape Town or Johannesburg, South Africa.
Yeah.
So you really have to think about the ecosystems as individual. I probably spent the most time in Nigeria. So at the time, there was much less local capital. And so it's a very nascent and new developing ecosystem.
Right.
And now we've seen more funds start getting started in Nigeria, which is great. I think that local capital problem and that local capital issue is starting to get solved a little bit. But you also saw some of the most entrepreneurial people coming out of Nigeria with amazing companies. And so I was really interested in being able to support founders from everywhere.
Has there been a big hit out of Africa yet, or like a big?
You've certainly seen a lot of, there are great companies like Paystack, like Flutterwave. So you are seeing companies. I don't know if you're calling it a hit, but you're seeing companies who are doing really well.
It sort of happened in Southeast Asia, where they like investing in Singapore, like nobody would really invest in a startup because there hadn't been a big $100 million exit. Mm-hmm. And VCs are very egotistical, but they didn't think they'd be the first $100 million exit.
Right.
And then a company called Viki, which did like cross-border.
I remember Viki.
Yeah, translations of basically Korean soap operas into Portuguese, got acquired by Rakuten for $100 million.
Right.
And then everybody's mind shifted and said Southeast Asia can create an exit.
Well, Jumia just went public, right?
Yeah.
And so you can certainly make an argument for how that is not an African company.
Yeah.
But it remains to be seen whether VCs will see that and call it an African success story.
Right.
I hope they do.
Yeah, I hope so.
I hope if anything good comes out of the Jumia IPO,
Right.
I hope that it is more VCs investing in and being interested in truly African companies.
Yeah. And I think at the end of the day, VCs are just mostly trying to make money. So if they look
Yes.
at it and they think, okay, it's getting started, like I need to move into the next sort of pasture here and make money, it'll kind of happen.
Yeah, and YC has done a great job of continuing to invest in companies that come out of sub-Saharan Africa.
Yep.
So there's certainly a lot of early capital that has been deployed there.
So how is the experience at 500? Now you're an investor at 500 startups. Like, how is this experience? It's different from what you've done before. You have one of the 5 jobs a year that happens in venture capital. Like, you've arrived.
Right, I've arrived. It was great because it was everything that I loved to do and was already doing, but now getting paid for it.
Right. So 500 Startups has a lot of things compared to many ventures. They have multiple funds. They have Geeks on a Plane.
Right.
Was it a complex organization to manage or be a part of compared to
definitely
2 guys and 2 fleeces or however it works for everyone else?
Compared to 2 guys and some Patagonia, it's definitely a much more complex organization. And so, there's a lot of there's the education piece where they're doing Venture Unlocked, and there are the global funds that are being launched, Japan and the Middle East. And then there's the main fund, the seed fund, and
Right.
so there are a lot of moving parts.
Mm-hmm.
And so that makes it that brings a level of complexity. For me, to be quite frank, the way that I handled it was to decrease my personal involvement in the complexity, to carve out the area where I thought I could be most successful and most helpful, and just say, this is what I do. It's great that all this other stuff exists, but I'm going to put the blinders on, and this is where I'm going to focus.
And is this where you invest in some of the companies I mentioned? I'd mentioned Blavity and CourtBuddy and
exactly. So Blavity was my very first deal ever at 500, and they just raised a Series A from Google Ventures last year.
Wow,
which is great.
That's great.
Morgan DeBon and her team are doing really well, and I'm super excited to see their success.
That's fantastic. And what are these like? Are these companies in a theme, or what are these types of companies?
So Blavity, definitely. So my investing point of view is that we're underway of really, really big demographic shifts and really big demographic changes.
Right.
And so for me, there are 3 of them.
Yep.
It's the 10,000 baby boomers turning 65 every day.
Mm-hmm.
It's the increased spending power in the hands of women.
Yep.
And then the third is the shift to majority minority, where Latino, African American, and Asians will be the majority in the U.S. and are already the global majority.
Right.
So I'm looking for businesses that can be global scale businesses that touch one or more of those 3 demographic shifts.
Right. And to be clear, you've moved on from 500 startups and will now invest on your own and build your own thing, but continue to be a venture capitalist.
I will continue to be a venture capitalist and continue to manage money and
so in terms
invest in great companies.
In terms of your theme, this is really interesting because in the world of venture capital, some investors invest. The firm will have a thesis, so they will say, we invest in fintech. Financial technology is just beginning, and so that's what we want to do. I'm surprised by the number of investors who have a thesis that's not very, it's like, we want world-changing entrepreneurs.
Right.
Which is great.
Yeah.
But to be honest, you really don't know when you see a company, hey, I met a world-changing entrepreneur. And by the way, if you meeting some of these entrepreneurs early on, I don't know what that looks like. So it's when somebody has a thesis, it makes it much more, and you understand that thesis, it really kind of makes it a lot easier for you to attract the kind of deals that you want, but both for entrepreneurs to find you. Because if somebody says, hey, I've got a thing that can analyze your server logs in real time, you're like, okay, well, no.
Right.
And then for other investors to say, hey, I saw something, I'd like you to participate.
Yeah.
So what, of these themes, what do you see happening, for example, of people turning 65 at the rate of 10,000 people a day. Like, what do you think that sort of leads us to?
So I'm an investor in a company called Silver Nest, and Silver Nest is home sharing for aging adults. So if you think about your home, it's your biggest asset. And as you get older, how do you maintain that asset and how do you stay in it? I think at some point you're getting older and your kids come to visit and they realize that their parent is much older now than the last time they were there.
Yep.
And they're living in this 1,500 square foot, home. So how can you help people share that home and both extract the value of, community and companionship, but also be able to afford to stay in that home on a reduced or lower salary.
Right.
And so that's an example of the sort of thing that I'm looking for when I think about, the 10,000 baby boomers who are reaching retirement age, or how do you help them use better technology to manage estate planning? We're underway of one of the biggest shifts in wealth from baby boomers to their children.
Yep.
And existing financial products are poor
Right.
in that category. And so how do you help them think about that using better technology? What about, after life and death?
Mm-hmm.
Is there a way to use technology to make that a better experience?
Right. That's like such an obvious and clear thesis. What about women taking control of the purse strings of much of the spending in this country?
Yeah. So women are, have direct responsibility for a lot of spending, and in about 66% of household spending, and indirect influence of even more of that. So you're certainly seeing like Rent the Runway and Glossier, which have
big hits.
Huge hits,
Yeah.
all based on a female consumer base. Right. And so you can even point to the success of Pinterest, huge 90% female consumer base.
Yeah. Right.
So we're already seeing these types of big hits that are driven by the female internet user. And then you can also take a look at how do women manage fertility as they continue their careers. Yep. Maybe they decide early that I have so many friends who are freezing their eggs.
Right.
So how can you enable employers to keep women in the workforce longer, for as long as they choose to be, and also empower them to start families when they want to?
Yeah.
So how do you use technology to impact that family planning, like carrot fertility, for instance?
Yeah, that's Carol Sandburg's idea, where she's like, women make these decisions because they know they're going to have a kid, but rather than just going full blast all the way and then saying, oh, sorry guys, I'm having a kid, I'll see you in a little bit, that they start making decisions early,
right?
Like stepping back, leaning back, taking lighter jobs. And I think her point is like, don't do that.
Yeah.
Like just go. And then when you have a kid, then you'll be someone different. You'll be the partner at the firm and have more power to do what you want to do.
Yeah.
And what of the, what's the third one is the...
And the third is the shift to majority. And so that's where you see, I invested in, as an angel, in Minted Cosmetics, which is a beauty brand for women of color. Mm-hmm. So that actually touches two of the categories, right? It touches increased spending power of women, and it touches, increasingly diverse consumer base. Yeah. So, certainly the consumer market is ripe for that sort of thing. Blavity also falls into that lane. Blavity is a media platform for Black millennials, right. And is not just Blavity anymore, but it's also Shadow and Act and 2190, all of these other sub brands. But it can be anything from, let's think about how we help Latino families save money for college, right? How do we help? So you have more and more multicultural families. How do you help them get better kids' entertainment through a company like Encantos that I invested in?
So who are the entrepreneurs who are creating these companies? Are they in that? I guess it wouldn't always be in the demographic of what they're creating. Like, who are they? Are they white guys creating things for other people, or are they people in these? Yes,
groups? And so, so certainly, Morgan DeBon is a young Black woman who falls into the demographic of the user that she is going after, and so you certainly see a lot of great Black Hispanic, Asian entrepreneurs who are doing things in these categories. But there is something that I call, is it artificial gating or is it natural gating? So for me, artificial gating is when you're starting something and you say, I'm going to create Zoom for Latinos.
Mm-hmm.
And I look at you and I go, Zoom for Latinos is Zoom.
Yes, 100%.
But then there is something called natural gating. And so you naturally gate a product when you see that the user base is what it is. So for instance, Maven is hair extensions, a hair extension company, right. 500 startups portfolio company. And often the biggest consumer of hair extensions is Black women. Right. That is a naturally gated product.
That is such a thoughtful, I was founded one of the first social networks, and we were big all over the world and in Asia. And our board members were like, we got to go figure out what people in Asia want. It's like, they want a photo uploader to put up pictures of their friends. Their friends happen to be Asian.
Right.
But the photo technology is the same.
Right.
And they were like, no, it must be something different.
Occasionally, the product, it's really about product level innovation. Yeah. So what are the triggers that you are using to deliver product level innovation that captures the audience that is most likely to use your product? Right. And as these audiences grow, they are going to be everyone's biggest audience, right. Because that is the way that the demographic right. shifts work. Right. And so every company will really need to think about how they are, how they are targeting women and how they are targeting Latino audiences and how they are targeting African American audiences. And the risk of not doing that is that you end up with, something like Twitter, where right. Black Twitter is huge, right. but they haven't been able to capitalize on it.
Interesting. So how do you parse, as people sort of invest in, ask you to deploy their money into companies, how do you, here's an example. I talked to a guy who's running a fund investing in Washington, D.C., and he's investing in minorities in Washington, D.C. Mm-hmm. It's a venture fund. And his thesis is that it's an untapped market, so he gets better deal flow, yeah. and he can get into deals more cheaply. Good old-fashioned capitalist.
Yeah, arbitrage.
And they're going to come up and that they're just as talented as everybody else and going to create a bunch of value. But as he talks to people and raises money, some people want to give him money.
Right.
Like, oh, you're helping minorities. Here's some money. He's like, minorities may end up being helped, but I'm trying to make you rich person, right. a richer person.
I am trying to turn $1 into $3.
Yes. How do you parse that issue? Do you get that issue from people?
I absolutely get that because I invest in all types of founders, but along these demographic themes. Mm. And so, to your earlier question, yes, it could be two white guys who are, building a fintech product, but that fintech product happens to be able to help, Latino or African American households. Right. Better save, spend, invest money, right? And so I was on the phone with an investor, and I said, I went through my pitch, my spiel, yeah. and they said, oh, well, we don't invest, and this is an institutional investor, and they said, we don't do social impact investing out of our main fund. We have a foundation that does all of that. All that diversity investing. And I said, I have not mentioned the word diversity in this conversation.
Yep.
I think that a diverse portfolio leads to better returns. There's certainly data that we can point to do that. But I take care of diversity on the fund manager, VC side of the table, not on the optimizing for different types of company founders side of the table. You get a lot of that.
Yeah.
And, and if you are doing a fund for women or a fund for minorities or the new majority, as I like to say, that is fine. That is great. We need more of those. But that happens to not be my thesis, but a lot of people get it conflated. Yeah. And so, then you have to step back and say, is this person a person that I actually want money from?
Right. Move on to the next one. Well, this is great. So how are you feeling now that you're a venture capitalist, and how are you feeling about Silicon Valley in the future now? What is your?
Yeah.
Are we on our way, or?
I was really feeling less optimistic about Silicon Valley for quite some time. And I was actually thinking about, should I move to LA? Should I move to New York?
Oh, wow.
And I've decided to double down on San Francisco for now, with the caveat that I've been spending a lot of time in other ecosystems that I find really interesting.
Right.
I've certainly been going to LA a lot. I feel like every VC is going to LA.
Yeah.
But I've also been going to places like New Orleans and Albuquerque, New Mexico, and, helping them think through how do we increase the amount of local capital, and how do we better support entrepreneurs who can start, stay, and grow here? Because I believe that you can start a great company anywhere, and I'm much more willing to get on a plane than some guy who's calling in rich
Right.
on like Fund 4.
I do get why they do it. They don't get on a plane. They get out of their house in Hillsboro and drive down the road.
Totally.
It must be lovely.
It's great. But I mean, I will get on a plane and hunt for those deals in New Orleans just as easily as I will get on, BART and go to, mid-market.
Yeah. Wow. This is fantastic.
Thank you.
This has been a great conversation.
Yeah, I've enjoyed it.
I really appreciate this.
No, thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, how do people get in touch with you? Monique Woodard has been my guest. If they need to get in touch with you, do they find you on Twitter?
You can find me on Twitter at Monique Woodard or my website, monique.vc.
All right. Thanks so much. This has been the Something Ventured podcast. I'm Kent Lindstrom. See you next time.